I'd like to start with a quote today. It is a widespread popular impression that each new scientific advance is another nail in God's coffin. That's how Professor Lennox starts his first chapter in the book God's Undertaker, Has Science Buried God? The reason why some people are convinced that science buries God is because they believe that with every new scientific discovery, there are less gaps to fill for God, and so one day he will simply disappear. To put it in the words of the famous chemist and atheist Peter Atkins, there is no reason to suppose that science cannot deal with every aspect of existence. Only the religious, among whom I include not only the prejudiced but the underinformed, hope there is a dark corner of the physical universe, or of the universe of experience, that science can never hope to illuminate. But science has never encountered a barrier, and the only grounds for supposing that reductionism will fail are pessimism on the part of scientists and fear in the minds of the religious. So in today's video, I'll summarize Professor Lennox's response to the idea that God as an explanation is unnecessary, as science will explain everything if we wait long enough. Just for context, Professor Lennox is Emeritus Professor of Mathematics at the University of Oxford. One of the things science will never be able to explain is itself. So science will never be able to show its own consistency. To prove that this is true, Professor Lennox quotes Kurt Gödel, who was arguably the greatest mathematician of the 20th century. Gödel proved that there are statements that cannot be proven, and that one of those improvable statements is the consistency of a system itself. To be exact, Gödel proved in his first incompleteness theorem that in any system that has a finite set of axioms and rules of inference, and which is large enough to contain ordinary arithmetic, there are always true statements of the system that cannot be proved on the basis of that set of axioms and those rules of inference. And in his second incompleteness theorem, Gödel proved that one of the statements that cannot be proven in a sufficiently strong formal system is the consistency of the system itself. Professor Lennox concludes that Peter Atkins' statement, which I quoted before, is incorrect. And if you're interested to learn more about Gödel's incompleteness theorems, I highly recommend a fascinating video by Veritasium on that topic. By the way, Kurt Gödel isn't only known for his incompleteness theorems, but also for his mathematical proof for God's existence, and I'll link a video with an explanation to that one in the description as well. So Christianity is not postulating a God to explain scientific questions that science can't explain yet. As the Christian apologist Richard Swinburne put it, I'm not postulating a God of the gaps, a God merely to explain the things that science has not yet explained. I'm postulating a God to explain why science explains. I do not deny that science explains, but I postulate God to explain why science explains. Now let's look in more detail how these two types of explanations, the scientific and the religious one, can complement each other. As I've shown in my summary of the book Can Science Explain Everything?, science and religion don't compete with each other as explanations of reality, as they explain different aspects of reality. Here I'd like to expand on two analogies which I mentioned only briefly in that previous video. First, we have the analogy of Aunt Matilda's cake, which illustrates the limitations of science by showing that while scientists can thoroughly explain the composition and structure of the cake, they cannot determine its purpose. So the only way to find out why the cake was baked is by asking Aunt Matilda. This highlights that science excels at answering how questions, but often falls short on why questions, which concern purpose and intent. Only Aunt Matilda, the creator, can reveal the cake's purpose, just as deeper existential questions may require answers from outside the realm of science. It's important to note that this doesn't mean that reason becomes irrelevant or inactive at that point. Quite the opposite is true. Understanding Aunt Matilda's explanation about whom the cake was made for requires us to use our reason. Additionally, we need reason to evaluate the credibility of her explanation. If she says she made the cake for her nephew Jimmy, and we know that she doesn't have a nephew by that name, we will doubt her explanation. If we know she does, her explanation will make sense. In other words, reason is not opposed to revelation. It is simply that her revelation about the cake's purpose provides reason with information that reason cannot access on its own. Some scientists and philosophers believe that we shouldn't even ask why the universe exists, arguing that there is no reason to look for a purpose because none exists. They maintain that since any chain of reasoning must begin somewhere, we might as well start with the universe's existence. Professor Lennox quotes the physicist Edward Tryon, who wrote, "Our universe is simply one of those things which happen from time to time." However, Professor Lennox objects that by claiming that the universe just sprang into existence is as unscientific as answering why apples fall by saying they just do. Here I'd like to add that postulating God as an explanation for the existence of the universe does not commit the God of the gaps fallacy, because the theistic argument doesn't say that we don't know what caused the universe, therefore it was God. On the contrary, it can be deduced philosophically what characteristics this first cause must have had, and this cause, with those characteristics, is commonly referred to as God. For example, it can be deduced that the cause of time was timeless, and because this cause also created matter, the cause was immaterial. Professor Lennox doesn't touch upon those philosophical deductions in his book, but I will delve into the topic in more detail in a video this summer. Another analogy Professor Lennox likes to use concerns the Ford motor car. Someone from a remote part of the world, seeing a Ford motor car for the first time and knowing nothing about modern engineering, might imagine that what makes the engine run is a god, we call him Mr. Ford, who is inside the engine. He might think that when the engine runs smoothly, it's because Mr. Ford inside the engine likes him, and when it doesn't, it's because Mr. Ford dislikes him. If he then studied engineering and took the engine apart, he would discover that there's no Mr. Ford inside. He would realize that he doesn't need to invoke Mr. Ford to explain how the engine works. However, if he concluded that understanding the principles of internal combustion made it impossible to believe in the existence of Mr. Ford, who designed the engine in the first place, he would be making a category mistake. Without Mr. Ford, the mechanisms he understands wouldn't even exist. Mr. Ford wouldn't appear in a scientific description of internal combustion laws, but that doesn't prove Henry Ford never existed. Similarly, the argument that science doesn't need God to describe nature doesn't prove that God doesn't exist. Without Mr. Ford, the mechanisms he understands wouldn't even exist in the first place. Mr. Ford wouldn't appear in a scientific description of internal combustion, but that doesn't prove Henry Ford didn't exist. Similarly, the argument that science doesn't need God to describe nature doesn't prove that God doesn't exist. Professor Lennox also writes that science can even point to God. For the sake of completeness, I'd like to mention that science can't prove God's existence because God's existence is a philosophical question. I'll talk about the limits of scientific evidence for God in my next video. But even though science can't prove God exists, it can point towards his existence. For example, the famous former atheist Anthony Flew writes that science spotlights 3 dimensions of nature that point to God. The first is the fact that nature obeys laws. The second is the dimension of life, of intelligently organized and purpose-driven beings, which arose from matter. The third is the very existence of nature. The first point, namely that nature obeys laws, points to the idea that the universe is grounded in the nature of the ultimate rationality of God. And believing that the universe is intelligible and can be described with scientific laws is an unconscious derivative from theism. Or as the eminent historian of science and mathematician Sir Alfred North Whitehead puts it, modern science must come from the medieval insistence on the rationality of God. My explanation is that the faith in the possibility of science, generated antecedently to the development of modern scientific theory, is an unconscious derivative from medieval theology. Similarly, C.S. Lewis writes that men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believe in a lawgiver. The astronomer Johannes Kepler once said that the chief aim of all investigations of the external world should be to discover the rational order which has been imposed on it by God, and which he has revealed to us in the language of mathematics. In conclusion, science can't bury God, and scientific discoveries are far from being nails in God's coffin. For someone who believes in God, every new scientific discovery reveals the beauty of nature, and therefore gives reason for renewed admiration of God and his creation. Now let's get to my opinion on the book. The thing is, there were chapters which I liked, but there were also chapters which I didn't like at all. And the reason I made this video in the first place is because of the chapters I liked. Usually, when I really don't like a book, I don't make a video about it in the first place because I don't want to summarize a book that wasn't worth reading. With this book, however, I liked the first couple of chapters, which is what I summarized in this video, and the last few chapters were also fine. But some of the chapters in the middle of the book bothered me, and I'll tell you why. In chapter 5, Professor Lennox criticizes the fact that the theory of evolution may not be criticized, and he points out that in order for science to grow, standard wisdom must be questioned. So far, I fully agree. And it would have been fine if Professor Lennox stayed on this meta-scientific plane and talked about the fact that science can and must be questioned for it to grow. I personally don't have any particular problem with evolution. I just agree with the assertion that questioning is good and not questioning is suspicious. As Richard Feynman once said, science is the belief in the ignorance of experts. The problem is that Professor Lennox, who is a mathematician and a Christian apologist, took on the task of criticizing macroevolution himself. This is a problem for two reasons. First of all, because biology is way outside of his area of expertise, and second of all, because in my opinion, it undermines the point of his book. What the book tries to show is that science and religion can coexist in harmony. And so for me, it seems to be very weird to criticize some scientific theory in a book like that. Interestingly, Professor Lennox was fully aware of the fact that criticizing evolution, particularly as a mathematician, was a risky endeavor. So he literally wrote in the book, "So I've decided to take the risk. For me, it's a double risk, in fact, since I'm a mathematician and not a biologist. Since in the view of many, even the modest level of questioning is nothing short of suicidal, I might as well begin by assuring the reader that, should I naturally select my own demise, I have already composed my own brief epitaph. Here lies the body of John Lennox. You ask me why he's in the box? He died of something worse than pox, on Darwinism, heterodox." I don't understand why he felt the need to criticize evolution in the book, particularly because his other arguments don't depend on evolution being wrong. I'd like to add that this book was written in 2002, and it was one of his first apologetic books. And I've previously rated another one of his books a 10 out of 10, which was written in 2019. So for me, this looks like he realized that his first approach was not ideal, and so he improved it. Either way, since there were some good ideas in the book, I decided not to throw out the baby with the bathwater, and I took the chapters I liked and ignored the chapters I didn't like. In total, I don't recommend the book, at least not in its entirety. That's been it for today. I hope you liked the video. See you soon, God bless, and bye!